We're going to be in Mark. Again, we're looking at the Gospels and how each one of them deals with Jesus coming into Jerusalem, looking at the different messages that they have. A couple things as we enter into Mark, we want to remember a couple of things. First of all, every book in the Bible has a context. All right, it's been written to stand alone, and we need to look at it as alone. It does, however, have connections with other books through themes and issues, but it has a context, and it's about a certain author. The author here we believe is to be John Mark, Mark, who becomes traditionally is the son of the woman who had a house where they celebrated the Last Supper in Jesus' last days, traditionally. Also, we know that Mark was the interpreter for Peter, and so a lot of these stories come from what he heard Peter talk about or preach about. The Greek that is used by Mark is a very, I guess you would say, low-class language. It's very basic, gutter language, basically. It's not as sophisticated as Luke or John or Matthew. In fact, when I had to do translations in school, I used Mark because he's a lot easier to understand than the others. So it's easier to translate. Basic translations here. Also, is you looking at how do we read Mark or any other Gospels, remember you're reading narratives, stories. And you want to look at the Gospel of Mark in two ways. First of all, you want to look at it as a novel. That is, it's taking you through a process of getting to know who the characters are, getting to know what the plot is, getting to know the themes of what's going on. But you also want to remember these are stories that are strung together. And so they're like short stories. So you have to deal with these stories as short stories that are connected in a specific way. Mark was the first gospel we believe was written. It really didn't come into great importance until around the 1920s, 1930s. Prior to that, it was considered just an addendum to Matthew. It wasn't considered much until we realized it was probably the first that was written. And we learned this by the fact that the other Gospels, Luke and Matthew, will draw from Mark's stories and will either expand the stories or will give you a different thought of the stories or will take less of the stories. There's a couple of stories that are really difficult in Mark to understand, and so the later Gospels, Luke and Mark, leave out certain items from certain stories because those stories were difficult in understanding. There's a specific audience that Mark is writing to. We don't know what that audience is. It's following Peter, so we have a good understanding of where Peter has been. But understand, in those days, there weren't publishing houses. And so if you were going to write something, you had to write something to an audience, to a person. All right? So this was written specifically to a group somewhere in the first century. We don't know exactly who. All right? As in any narrative, there are two elements that you have to watch for. What is said, or that is what is seen, what is said, and what is hidden. There are two principles whenever you look at a narrative, especially in the Gospels, to look at what is seen or heard, and then also what is hidden. And we're going to be looking at a couple of those ideas today. As we begin with Mark, I kind of want to take us through a couple passages early on in Mark to get us an understanding of what's going on. The first one is found in Mark 1:1. You don't have to turn there. Mark 1:1. I'm just going to be in that one passage. It says the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. So he's beginning to tell you this is the gospel. I'm writing a gospel. The question becomes, Is it a gospel about Jesus Christ, or is it a gospel Jesus Christ? Is the gospel the stories about Jesus Christ, or is the gospel Jesus Christ? And there's a distinction. What do you think the distinction might be between stories about Jesus and good news about that is Jesus? In other words, is Jesus the object or the subject? Why is it important to understand the person of Jesus? The good news, Jesus. Why is it as opposed to stories about Jesus? Because we've often studied stories about Jesus. And I think Mark is trying to tell us something here, that Jesus Christ is the good news. Not stories about Jesus is the good news. Jesus is the good news here, understanding that. And there's a distinction, especially when you get into other religions and comparing the religions. This is a very distinctive issue because you see, you can find positive things in all of the religions. You can find some of the sayings of Jesus in Buddhism, in Hinduism, in Islam, and various things. And there's a lot of people who are saying, well, see, there are many roads to God because you can see all these positive things. And each group will tell you about the positive things. What's distinctive here is the fact that Jesus Christ is the good news. Not stories about him, but Jesus is the good news that he's portraying. And he's going to be expanding on that. The next passage we have in Mark that I want to talk about comes from chapter 8. All right, and I think it's, you don't have to turn there. He goes to Caesar, come on, Doug. Caesarea Philippi. Okay. This is distinction. Yes, 8:27. And Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. And on the way, he asked his disciples, what's the significance? What's hidden here that Jesus is in Caesarea Philippi? Caesarea Philippi. What's the significance of him being in that village? What is Caesarea Philippi? That's the Gentiles, the Romans. This is where the Roman soldiers are at. This is where the Roman governor is at. This is where all your Roman people are, and the Gentiles are here. They have theater here. They have the Colosseum here. They have the races here. Everything that is Gentile-oriented is in Caesarea Philippi. All right? It's significant that he goes there, and he goes there for a reason. He wants to be alone with his disciples. There's a change here that's taking place in the Gospel of Mark in 8:27. And that change is now no longer, Jesus is going to focus on his final trip to Jerusalem. And he begins here because what we see from here until the end is Jesus' concentration on his disciples. All right? Occasionally crowds are going to come in and they're going to hear and he's going to teach them, but he's really specifically gained toward his disciples. This is important because Mark is focusing on the same thing. In telling of these stories and arranging them, he's talking to his disciples of his time, his audience. And so that means that our ears have to perk up here, because the messages he has to them is the same message that Mark has for us today. Now, understanding that when we study Mark, this is ancient language. It's not language that is used today. This Greek is ancient, all right? And so what you have in front of you are translations of that, hopefully. All right? The reason I say that is because some Bibles have a translation that comes from the original language and some that do not. And so you have to be very careful about what you're using and to get a meaning from that. If you're going to study with someone, especially a new convert, especially someone who hasn't had any experience in the Bible, use the same Bible they are using. Because inevitably you're going to get the same questions I get in every class is, my Bible doesn't say that. Okay? And that may confuse people because we have a different way of expressing ourselves in language. This is true. This past week I was watching Forensic Files. Anybody watch Forensic Files? Very interesting. You would imagine how forensics are used today in discovering things. One of the things they had was a forensic literature person. I forget what they called it. But he was engaged in some writings, and they wanted to know whether these writings were of one person who was already dead or are they of someone else. Linguistics. And so what he did was he took 20 years of this guy's writings, and he compared them. And he made a very interesting statement, which is true when we're looking at the Bible. And he said it's not just the words they use. It's how these words are used to determine, which is very important. Because up until around 1980, we put emphasis on the word. What does the word mean? What we didn't realize was people use words differently. And so a word that used by John may be used differently than in Mark. And so we have to understand that as we study Scripture, that words are important, but how words are used helps us understand what is hidden in there. So he talks to us about Caesarea Philippi. He goes there for a reason. What's hidden is he's got to talk to his disciples. I am now going to turn my attention to Jerusalem, and I'm going to turn my attention to you. It is between here and the coming of Jesus entering the temple that he uses the 3 times he will say that I am going to be arrested, be tried, be killed, and resurrected on the 3rd day. All right, he's preparing the disciples for this last troop to Jerusalem. Okay. And he asks them in 27, who do people say I am? And they say, and then he said, who do you say I am? All right. Again, this is a message to his audience. He's just not relating a story. Who do you say I am? And so the same thing comes to our question. Who do we say Jesus is? Not just who he is technically, but who he is in our life. Because each of us are going to have a different story about Jesus as he interacts with us in life. Because he's going to interact differently with each of us. All right? So who do you say I am as they prepare to go to Jerusalem? Okay, now we can go to 10. And I want to begin in 10:29. Now, a lot of these stories we studied with Matthew. And be baptized with my baptism. So he's asking Christians. Mark puts this in for a reason. And it's about where is your faith? If you want to sustain life, your faith must be in Jesus Christ, not in what stories about Jesus Christ. And so if you're going to have faith in Christ, you must have understanding that it may lead to your persecution and your death. And are you willing? So he's putting this in not just that Jesus is asking his disciples. Mark is asking his audience. And the Gospel of Mark today is asking us the very same question. Are you willing to drink the cup I drink, or to be baptized with the baptism which I am baptized. And we saw that in Matthew, that it was about self-sacrifice. It's just not the cup of forgiveness of sins, which is true, death, but it's much more than that. Are you willing to drink the cup I drink, which means following God? So he asks the question, where is our faith based on? Is our faith based on what we think we should be doing, or the things of man, or the things of God? And now, understanding that the things of God are something we learn along the way. Our faith is not once only. It is developed as we go through life. As we experience, that faith either becomes stronger or it becomes less. And I have met people who have walked away from God because of some issue in their life. Maybe a death of a loved one, or some kind of calamity in their life. Why would God allow this? And walk away. When I was, I used to get phone calls all the time when I was, because of Sandy Hook, massacre of Sandy Hook in Connecticut, children. And I would get questions, why would God allow this? And people would say, I can't believe in a God that would allow this. So, and I didn't have an answer.
Most of the time when they're complaining about losing someone or some oddity that has taken place and taken people away from us, they're not talking about why did God allow it. They're talking about why did God do it.
Good point. Very good point. Yes, that's a better way of saying it. Why did God do this? Not why did God allow this? We tend to use God allow it, but it's actually why did God do this? When I first started working at Red Lobster as a line cook, there was a young lady there who got pregnant. High school got pregnant, and she said to me, she says, "Why did God do this to me? Why did God do this to me?" We chuckle about it, but people believe that God directs all things in our life. He does, and I've heard it so many times. God did this or God did that, In those days, and they get it from the Bible, because in the Bible, ancient times, people believed that everything that happened came from God. You had a good harvest, it was because of God. You had a bad harvest, that's because you sinned, and God gave that to you. And so good weather, bad weather, now we understand jet streams, right? Now, if I'm living in Wichita today with the same idea that God brings on the weather, what am I thinking about? Because we have such a dry season. What did we do? How did we sin?
A lot of times when people say, why did God do this to me? It's really about choices that they've made. And there are always consequences for the choice we make, either good or bad.
I think in part of who we are, there is this thing called fate. Fate with Christians is different from fate in the rest of the world. With fate in the rest of the world, your destiny is already plotted. It's your fate if you're going to become a minister. It's your fate that you're going to become something else. Or if you're going to die, it's a matter of fate. Your time is up. How many times have we heard that? Your time is up. Right? Very important that we understand that. And so when 9/11 happened, or when Katrina happened, or the tsunami happened, I don't know how many famous Christians came out and said that happened because of sin in our country. And they blamed certain groups of people that caused that plane to be crashed. Because America is no longer God granted. God is sending us a message. Well, no, that isn't what happened. What happened was that a group of people decided they were going to take over the airplanes and crash into the towers. Or the hurricane winds decided they wanted to end up in the Mardi Gras city. So, it's understanding that's under our understanding. We get caught up in that sometimes. All right? Now, does that mean that we don't ask God for things? We ask God to have, our elected leaders, don't we? And what happens when we don't get them? Is God not listening to you? And then what do we do with those that we didn't want in office? How do we treat them? Was it God who put them into office? Did God want them there for a specific reason? How are we going to treat the opposing? I'm just using that as an example, please. But the idea is we do things and say things. So anyways, to come back to this idea, are you willing to be baptized with my baptism? Are you willing to kill yourself, deny yourself? Jesus already talked about that. If you want to follow me, you have to give everything up. Now, are you willing to do that? Are you willing to take that cup? All right? The cup can mean two things. It can either mean the wrath of God or it can mean joy. I read a story one time that in ancient Israel, during the time they were arranging marriages, of course, you didn't date someone in those days. You didn't get to take them to the movies or get to take them out to dinner and sit there and wait for them to ask you the question. In those days, it was arranged. Now, what happens is this, is the woman is presented to the man, the woman's family is presented to the husband's family, and the dowry is presented. In those days, the woman passed down the dowry. All right? If the husband accepted the wife and the dowry, he would drink from a cup and then offer the cup to his wife to be, and she would drink of the cup. And so it was a cup that would bind them together. All right? So this idea of cup could mean different things. It can mean, are you willing to be joined to Jesus? And what that entails. You have to give up your life. To be baptized, meaning to be what? Why use the imagery of being baptized? Are you willing to accept the change? Whatever it might bring you. Whatever it might bring you, are you willing to accept that? And so as Jesus is asking the disciples this question, stating this point, Mark is doing the same thing with his disciples, with his audience, and with us today. All right, let's see here. 40, but to sit at my right hand or my left hand is not mine to grant, but it's for those to whom it has been prepared. Is there something hidden in there? It is not for me to grant, but it's for those to whom it has been prepared. What's kind of hidden there? Jesus is setting himself up to the authority of God. Even though he's king, and he has authority of kingship, that kingship really belongs to God the Father. All right? So even though he has the power, he's telling us that the good news about this Jesus is that he does what the Father does or wants. The same thing for us. We do what God wants of us, not what we want of ourselves. And that's a hard lesson to learn. Because still I haven't figured that one out yet. Right? And so that's part of our growth in life. We don't suddenly come out of the waters of baptism and say, okay, I'm okay now. I'm all set. Everything's fine. Everything's hunky-dory. Peaches and creams, everything's going to be just fine. No. You still have to deal with your old self. When I used to scuba, I don't know if I told this story. When I used to scuba dive in the ocean, there are two things going on in the ocean. There is the tides. They go in and out, But underneath the tides are currents, like a current of a river going through there. And so you can get caught in a current. And the current doesn't operate the same way that the tides do. The tides may be coming out, the current may be going out. And so one day I found myself in a current. And I'm going, well, I don't know if I want to go in this current. So I turned around and started to go against the current. In no less than 5 seconds, I was going with the current again. I couldn't tell you when that turned. I couldn't tell you how it turned me. But I know that as soon as I went against the current, boom, I was going the other way. All right? And so it takes us a different way. Through life, we find that if we don't correct our behavior will resurface. If we don't correct our behavior will resurface. All right? It's just natural. That's why they say it takes over 30 days to change a behavior, to change a habit. All right? Because within that 30-day period, what's that habit going to do? Your body's going to tell you, I want that. I want that. And it's going to get stronger and stronger and stronger. And if you don't change it, if you're not careful, you're going to go back to your old behavior. All right? And so Mark is saying, this Jesus Christ, the good news about Jesus Christ is you don't have to go back to that bad behavior. It can be changed. All right? And God is in the process of changing us. All right? He's in the process of changing us. All right? And again, Jesus talks about, starting in 42, what to those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles, lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. But it will not be so among you. All right? Again, Jesus is talking to his 12 disciples. Mark is talking to his audience. And the Gospel of Mark is talking to us today. To be great amongst us, we must be servants to one another. So again, Mark is bringing out this idea that faith is about change, and that change is about serving one another. Must be slave of all. Right? That's an interesting statement. Not slave of one another, but slave of all. Does that mean something different? Slave of all? Does that mean I have to be a slave of a non-Christian? Does that mean I'm a Republican, but I need to be a slave to a Democrat? Or I'm a Democrat, do I need to be a slave of a Republican? And so what does it mean to be a slave or a servant of someone else who may be different from you? I know it's easy, to love someone who loves you. But how much difficult it is to love someone whom you do not love or who does not love you. Life is difficult. Mark is saying this Jesus is going to help you do that. And so he gives us this idea of self-service. What is the baptism? What is the cup? It's just right here. Learning to serve, to give your life as a ransom for many. To give your life a ransom for many. How does that sit with you? How does that sit with you? Do you see yourself as a ransom for others? And if so, what way? Have you ever thought of yourself as a ransom for others? I know family members we do, right? We're a ransom, for family members or for our friends or for our church family. But in what way are we a ransom for the person who's pumping our gas or ringing up our groceries? Better still, how are we ransom for someone who doesn't think the way I think? Who doesn't act the way I think they should act? Are we a ransom to the Muslims? And if so, what way? Are we a ransom for the Buddhists, the Hindus, the Maoists, the Taoists, Confucianists? How do we see ourselves as a ransom for those? I don't know the answer to that.
I was going to say, boy, you're asking hard questions today.
I am, aren't I? And I don't have the answers to a lot of these questions. But these are what we face as we face life.
Well, it's not.
How do we change our behavior toward our enemy? And when I say enemy, I'm not talking just about someone who's got a gun at your head. I'm talking about someone who doesn't think the way you think, who stand in opposition to you. As conservatives, how are we ransom to our liberal brothers and sisters? Even within churches of Christ, you have conservative churches, you have liberal churches, you have middle of the road churches. Now, all churches believe they're middle of the road. All churches I know I've come across a couple who don't think they're middle of the road, but they all do that. But they're different. Now, what's really interesting is when they battle each other. And I say to them this: if they are a conservative church, they are ministering to conservative Christians. If they're a liberal church, they are ministering to liberal Christians. And if they're middle of the road, they are ministering to both, whoever. And so instead of condemning someone or a church, you just acknowledge the fact that God is working through that church for that specific group of people. Right? So how do we address, let me ask that question. How do we address different politics, since it's a political system? And we all have our idea of what our politics are. How do we address someone who's in direct opposition to what I think? Jerry?
It seems like most of the stuff that's important to talk about has nothing to do with politics. I mean, there's a lot of life that you share with someone. And politics is this little bitty bunch of names, and labels and thoughts and ideas. Why even go there? I mean, I have family members that we just never go to that little spot and have a fine relationship.
When my brother first got married and my sister-in-law decided she was going to do Thanksgiving at her house, and she was going to invite her family members, and Jimmy was going to invite his family members, and she didn't realize that there are two different
Ideology.
yes, two different ideologies coming in to bear, and it would drive her crazy. And she would just yell out, just shut up," until she realized that whenever they're brought together, boom, that kind of lessened out over time as her family members became less and less. But anyways, but that was an interesting lesson for her to learn.
It takes real effort to do that. And I think it takes a lot of love to do that and say, it just doesn't matter. Look at all the other stuff that does matter. And it's difficult because the rhetoric is just humongous everywhere, all around us.
Back in
It's
the
important that we can do that we can ignore that.
back in the 70s, the 80s rather, with Ronald Reagan being president, that's when things got really vicious. Started to get vicious with Ronald Reagan. I remember being at a Democrat gathering, and someone asked one of the Democrat senators how they were going to unite the party.
How they were gonna watch.
Unite the party. And she said something very interesting. She said, demonize your opponent. Demonize your opponent. And that's exactly what has been going on in the last 50, 60 years. And so much so that we base our elections on that, on the personality. And if someone is running and they don't believe what you believe, but you like that person, you vote for that person. Doesn't matter what their politics is, their ideology is. You like that person.
Well, that didn't start 60 years ago.
No.
If you read about some of the elections in the 19th century, those got pretty nasty too.
Yes, they did. Yes, they did. It just becomes now our. I'm sorry. My own cynicism is coming up, and I apologize. But
They didn't have the internet and TV
No,
and all
that's
that
true.
stuff
They
that
didn't.
pushes this stuff out into the public.
But the newspapers that were established were generally established to promote a certain ideology. We complain about media today being prejudiced.
It wasn't all encompassing the way it is today. The newspapers went out to that town, that area. Today, everything goes out everywhere. That's a
True.
big difference.
no,
But it was nasty.
yes,
Go back and read some of those histories
it was. There were papers that were.
about Abraham Lincoln.
Oh yeah, there was things said in a local paper that would be carried in another county in another part of the country. There were big newspapers.
Took
And-
longer to get it out.
Well, yeah. Well, by the time Lincoln came around, they had this thing called Morse code, and they would pass things on quickly. And so, Jerry? Oh, time to move on. Okay. But do you see how difficult things, choices that we have to make? And are we willing to make those choices? Are we willing to be the slave of someone else? Even though that person may irritate us. I once had someone said, it's easy to love someone, it's harder to like them. Which is an interesting statement he would make. It's easy to love someone, but it's more difficult to like them in relationship. Are we willing to make those choices? Are we willing to say to somebody, I'm going to be a slave? When Jesus says someone has something against you, what does he tell you to do? Go to them before you come to the altar. If someone has something against you, you have the responsibility to do what? Go to them. You don't wait for them to come to you. All right? That can be dangerous. But anyways, responsibility of change is on us. How we deal with things that are unpleasant. Not all of Jesus' sayings are easy. There are a lot of sayings Jesus has which are difficult. There's a lot of sermons which are difficult. And that's why Paul reminds us not to have our ears tickled. Be willing to hear the hard stuff, difficult stuff. All right. I got people closing their Bibles, so I guess it's time.